I'm back with Emerald Robinson, the White House correspondent for Newsmax. Now, Emerald, you've been covering a topic that's a little bit sensitive. It's a little bit of a taboo, but it's a topic that quite honestly is very well known to me. It's let's call it the institutional conservative movement. We're talking here about the think tanks, places like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution. Mm-hmm. I've actually been a fellow at all three. We're talking about the conservative magazines like the National Review, the first magazine actually I wrote for right out of college. Right. The now defunct Weekly Standard, the kind of never Trump apparatus, which at least originated on the right. And I think part of what you're saying, the message I get, is that there is a deep rot in institutional conservatism that the conservative activists and donors don't necessarily know about. Give a little bit of an overview of where exactly this rot is, because I want to get to, obviously our end goal is to fix it, to come out stronger, but let's start by identifying the problem.
Sure. Well, probably the main problem with Conservatism, Inc. is that it really only cares about the free market. It's not a movement for the people. It's a movement for corporations. So they don't care if the free market provides porn, abortion, drugs. If people want them and there's a demand, then, that's what they care about. So the people who only care about the free market become quote unquote libertarians, and libertarians really only care about low taxes. And on our network, Newsmax, not too long ago, there was a former Trump appointee, a Trump administration advisor. His name was Christian Witten, and I thought he summed it up really well. He said there's a problem with conservatism where there are a lot of people who don't want to fight cultural issues, like the Heritage Foundation you just mentioned. They say they don't do cultural issues, but the problem is, Dinesh, is that is where the fight is today, and that's what we're seeing in a lot of these elections, like the Virginia election last night. So if you look at the Supreme Court and the rulings we just got from Justices Amy Coney Barrett and from Kavanaugh, even this supposed conservative court is letting down true conservatism and what conservative Americans were promised. Those two justices are already looking weak, and the Federalist Society that put their names forward is looking like a joke. I mean, Barrett basically looks like a liberal soccer mom who's slightly to the right of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And here's what has happened. The whole conservative movement has essentially lost its way. And that's just half of those people. The other half basically got bought out by the left. So that's what happened when we're talking about National Review. That's what we're talking about when we talk about Jonah Goldberg, who used to be with the National Review and got let go, and then started the Dispatch and the Bulwark, which pretend to be conservative outlets, but take money from big tech, from Facebook and from Google. So they're not concerned about big tech censorship that a lot of conservatives, regular Americans, are experiencing, because they're more concerned about getting the money from these big tech companies. And that's what even though I cover the White House, I started talking to insiders and sources. And that's essentially what I broke back in 2018 about the Weekly Standard and about National Review. And the Weekly Standard has, as you know, now become defunct and folded.
I mean, you're making an interesting point here, which is that on the one hand, these groups say we're not going to focus on cultural issues. We're libertarians. Right. We care about libertarian issues. But even within libertarianism, it isn't just about taxes. It's also about basic civil liberties. And as far as I can see, none of these organizations have been front and center protecting churches and religious liberty, protecting free speech, the right to assembly. All those rights have been grossly violated, particularly now under COVID. And it seems like this institutional conservatism, if we can call it that, has been at best on the sidelines.
They have. And again, number one, a lot of it, like I said, comes down to that they just don't care about the cultural issues. They care more about taxes and corporations. But secondly, that they are paid to not care and to look the other way. So like in 2018, there were rumors going around DC. I was told by several solid sources that there was an audio tape of Google executives who have been recorded telling their colleagues, their fellow employees, that Google generously donated to conservative think tanks big groups that we thought of as on the forefront of the conservative movement at the time: AEI, CEI, the Cato Institute, CPAC, the Weekly Standard, the National Review. And essentially this executive was saying, we paid them to help water down legislation that would hold big tech accountable for their censorship and their policing of content. But what was crazy, Dinesh, is I kept hearing this. I wasn't given the story to run with. And I waited because it was given to the Wall Street Journal. And months went by and months went by, and the Wall Street Journal barely did a piece finally that really buried the story. It almost provided cover for these groups. And so I did finally tweet about it, that these Never Trump magazines and think tanks took money to suppress stories about the bias of conservatives and Trump supporters. That really unleashed people like Jonah Goldberg, who said that did not happen. But then he went and asked the National Review, and he had to backtrack that and admit that they had taken money. He said that they had supported their dinners. They gave him money, for their dinners, and that's how they got money. But he was saying, oh, but that's not really taking money. So then they started admitting it. We started seeing more. And now they still work with big tech, but they're more blatant about it because they actually do full page ads. But that's a problem, because if these are the conservative beacons, the conservative, intellectual magazines, and they don't have the interest of conservative thought and free speech, as what they're writing about or advocating for, then what are they conserving? I have yet to see what they've really managed to conserve in decades, except for their invites to coveted parties here in Washington, D.C., and their invitations to come on MSNBC.
Well, Emerald, I think what struck me is that over the years, these organizations like Hoover and AEI and Heritage have really lost influence. I mean, they're not influencing legislation, they're not influencing the culture, but one thing that they have mastered is the art of cultivating a donor. I remember I was at a conference years ago with very eminent people, Henry Kissinger and so on, and I noticed that these speakers, like Kissinger, weren't asked to speak. In fact, it was the donors who were offering comments to these guys. And so I went up to the, at that time, head of AEI, and I said, isn't this strange? We're going to a conference, but instead of asking these luminaries to talk, you have the donors talking. And he goes, that's because the whole event is for the donors. People don't want to go home and tell their friends, Henry Kissinger told me. They want to tell their friends, I told Henry Kissinger. So then I realized how clever these organizations have become in massaging the vanity of people and sort of getting money out of their wallets. But my point is, I wouldn't mind all that if I felt that they were using the money effectively. But the point is, we can just see what is it that these organizations have done lately to advance the cause. I think the answer is a whopping nothing.
Nothing. And just as you said, it's for the donors, because the Weekly Standard, the National Review, lost their readership. That's really one reason the owners of the Weekly Standard pulled the plug. They just didn't have an audience. There was no audience for anti-American, America First commentary. And so when I heard, I got a call from a source who was helping to do the downsizing to help close up shop, and they alerted me that this was going to happen. I happened to be in Brussels with Secretary Pompeo at the time, and I confirmed it with several other sources on the Weekly Standard and put that out there. And Stephen Hayes, remember Stephen Hayes, who had touted himself as such an influential conservative. He was always on Bret Baier's show until I wrote the Collapse of the Never Trump Conservatives article. And then there was a washout of Bret Baier's panel. In fact, Bret Baier's, one of his personal assistants, called me and screaming at me saying, you don't know what you've done. Look what you've done. And just a few days later, it was announced that Stephen Hayes would be leaving on a 1-year sabbatical to Spain. And some of the other Never Trumpers weren't back on the panel for some time. But they came in and closed up shop. Clarity Media called me. I thought this was crazy. I couldn't believe it at the time. Called me and asked what I thought about their personnel, who they should keep, who they should move over to the Examiner. And what they ended up doing was closing up the entire shop.
I mean, this is a
And
huge topic, Emerald. We're just going to touch upon it today. I mean, you point out in one of your articles that
there's a lot, Trish.
in 10 years, from 2009 to 2019, the Heritage Foundation alone raised nearly $1 billion. So demanding accountability for this money and making sure that this is not money, that these precious resources aren't being like put down a black hole on the right. This is something we're going to have to cover some more.
Yeah. And I would just like to say, too, when we talk about the money going from Google to outlets like the National Review, they say, well, it had no bearing on our coverage. You know, we still did articles, but that's not true. In fact, I talked to people who regularly wrote, specifically one person who regularly wrote for the National Review, and the National Review killed every article this person put forth on big tech censorship. So
Very
that's
interesting.
what this money is doing.
Emerald, thanks for coming on. I'll have to have you back some other time to delve into depth. There's just a lot of granular detail here, but I want to just let my listeners know that this is not a topic I intend to drop. I realize it's sort of is a little bit of a minefield, but we have to demand this kind of accountability because we want a lean, mean right going forward. Thanks, Emerald Robinson, for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's so good to be on with you.